Right. Just to recap in terms of, why we are looking at studying this unit and what we have to cover. So first things first, this unit is going to look at, how you look at working on your personal development. When you work within a business or an organization, the main aspect of, studying this particular unit is to look at how people develop within a particular situation. Now, this could be from a point of view of, learning and development. It could be from a point of view of training. It could also be from a personal perspective, wherein a lot of people learn and pick up a lot of new skills on a daily basis when they're at their place of work. And that continuous process is what we call the career professional development or, personal development. And in some cases, if that development is related to your place of work, it enhances your work experience and also gives you, maybe increases your capability to be able to do work, maybe at a senior level or in terms of your job responsibility, then we term that kind of, development as professional development. Now, in order for us to look at understanding this unit, what we try and do is do the practical aspect of undertaking an activity ourselves of, doing a SWOT analysis, and also then using that SWOT analysis, what we try and do is create some sort of a personal development plan. Now, learning is a concept which, is something which is, very carefully and very closely related to the aspect of, personal and professional development. So going further in terms of the unit, when we look at the, I think 3 or 4 learning outcomes there in the unit, the learning outcome 1 is purely theoretical, wherein we need to understand what are the approaches to learning, how learning happens on a self basis, and how this learning can be put into practice using, training and development and, other techniques, wherein we basically look at the approaches through which an individual can learn. How this learning, when it happens at the individual level, is beneficial to the individual and also is also beneficial to the organization. And then at some stage, what we look at is, how this learning actually helps in from an aspect of, the individual working within teams within an organization. And some bits of learning that we do, we also look at then doing a bit of reflection in terms to see how this learning has happened, what has brought about this learning, and how this learning is going to help me as an individual to develop maybe new skills or maybe advantages which I can bring across to my place of work or, my communication skills. So we look at the broader aspect of the implications of learning, and then we kind of classify learning into something called self-managed learning and learning which is lifelong. That means some of the things that we learn remain with us, throughout our life. Some of the things that at some point in time we learn and then we also unlearn. So the first learning outcome covers that aspect. The second one is basically related to the aspect of developing a personal development plan, wherein is the specific place where we need, for you to be able to complete maybe a SWOT analysis. Your identification of your strengths and weaknesses, your current skill set will help you try and develop some sort of a draft personal development plan. And that development plan is what we are going to look at in the learning outcome 3, to try and review that development plan and how to look at updating it as a working document, to try and include things that you've learned, take them off, try and include new things which you need to learn, so that there is continuous development happening on a personal as well as professional basis. And then with this particular learning outcome, we'll also do an activity related to the fact which does some sort of an audit on your skills. So if I say I have negotiation skills, or if I say I have leadership skills, if I say I have management skills, then we need to be able to do an audit, which will be a skills audit. And that is also a document that we will look at some stage in learning outcome 3. Learning outcome 4 basically looks at the aspect of how some of this learning which happens can help solve problems at work. So we define problems like, time management, for example, delegation. You look at issues wherein, or issues or problems which kind of arise because of the fact that, sometimes within, when you're working within teams, there are conflicts which get created, or, things which are, wherein sometimes we use the term like if I'm overstepping or if I'm stepping on somebody's toes. So those kind of work-related problems is what we will discuss in the aspect of learning out of 4, wherein we talk about skills, transferable skills, we talk about interpersonal skills, and how these skills, which are developed from both personal as well as professional aspect, help us do our work more, help us work more efficiently and more cordially within an organization, amongst teams and amongst colleagues. Going forward, so what we want to be able to do is, in order to have this unit understood and meet the assessment criteria required for an assignment, there are some documents that you need to create, and these documents would be becoming a part and parcel of your assignment when you do a submission. So the idea of looking at SWOT is directly related to one of the learning outcomes or the tasks in learning outcome 2. When you do a skills audit, is also related to one of the tasks and learning outcome, and the development of PDP is also related to learning outcome 2 and 3, so they become a part and parcel of your assignment. Now, going forward, let's look at the main area of what is, and understand some of these key concepts of, what do you call, self-managed learning and lifelong learning. These are the two approaches that we're going to look at. And let's look at very briefly, the concepts of, what is self-managed learning and what is the concept of lifelong learning. Now, self-managed learning, the definition of it, basically, when we looks at how people and individual actually learn or find ways to learn new things on a day-to-day basis, or in their daily life, or in the society. Now, self-managed learning is nothing about, looking at how you set out goals for yourself and how do you go out and achieve those goals. So an example here would be when I look at, from an approach of learning a new language. Now, I might want to learn or pick up a new language in terms of learning, say, for example, French. Now, this is something which is a personal goal which I'm setting, and what I would do is basically look at ways of understanding how I can do and how I can create these circumstances so I can learn French on my own without having to go to, say, an external organization for some lessons or for some tuitions. And this particular approach, which basically allows you to learn a particular language, in this case French, and then the things or the steps that you put in place to be able to do it yourself would be classified nothing but as self-managed learning. That means you have your own motivation, and because of your own motivation, you are looking at picking up a new language, French, and you decide on a certain series of steps which you take. Say, for example, you go out and buy a book, maybe you buy a dictionary, which is English to French, French to English, and then you look at maybe some channels which broadcast on, say, French language, would essentially all consume but consist of nothing but something called the process of self-managed learning. So here, what you're doing is you're describing and clearly setting out some goals, and to achieve those goals, you are looking at setting a series of steps in steps into action or motion, so that you're continuously moving in that direction to be able to understand, speak, read, write the new language, which is French. Another example that I would give you here would be from an example of self-managed learning, is that sometimes when you move into a new place, or you go to a new place because of relocation or whatever, you're able to pick up the different aspects of the culture, the behavior of people, and also adapt your personality accordingly, is because you are more tuned to the aspects of self-managed learning. That means you are looking at adapting yourself to be able to gel well within that particular environment or in that particular location. Now, certain advantages of self-managed learning are that it gives obviously you a chance to create your own strategy and give learning an own meaning, a new meaning which basically meets your criteria. And you might decide to set yourself realistic goals that you are looking at moving into that particular direction by acquiring knowledge, and also looking at obviously facing a few challenges, which could be challenges in the form of say technology, challenges in the form of skills that you need to develop. But this particular approach that you adapt without taking any external help is basically nothing but the concept of something called self-managed learning. Now, there are various approaches to understand this self-managed learning as a process. And what you do is in order to understand this, what we do is we try and understand what are the learning styles. Now, there are different types of learning styles which over the years have been created, and these learning styles kind of define a particular type or a trait and a particular personality type, which basically people look at. And sometimes we say that okay, he's a go-getter, or he's a hard worker, or he's a smart worker. And those are reasons why we say this is because that's how people learn. And because they've been learning on their own initiatives or through their own personal defined processes, this has led to the creation of definition of certain type of learning styles. That is what we are also going to look at. Now, there are different approaches. Once we look at learning styles, we'll also look at the various approaches through which you can actually learn yourself. Sometimes you say that, okay, I want to look at picking up this particular skill. So what I'll do is I'll enroll myself into a webinar, or when I'll go and try and attend a training. And that is nothing but an approach that you take to be able to look at learning something new in terms of either a trait or a skill or something that is going to be helpful for you at your place of work, or in the development of your personality. Then at some stage, what we will look at is what constitutes effective learning, and how this particular process of self-managed learning and effective learning is different from lifelong learning. And then towards the end in the presentation, what we are going to look at is the assessment of learning in terms of, does this help in terms of the two approaches where you look at which is an approach which helps you more in terms of whether you learn yourself, or in some cases you need personal and professional supervision to be able to pick up something that you're trying to learn. And those are the two things that we look at in terms of assessment, in terms of which method is much more suitable to be able to help you learn or pick up a new skill, or in this case, say for example, pick up something which is going to be beneficial for you at your place of work or in your personal life. Now, self-managed learning, neatly summarized on this particular slide, basically talks about it is nothing but the process of self-initiation. That means you want to learn yourself, so you start this process yourself. Imagine a small child. I think the example that I normally always end up giving is, you imagine a child, from a very young child, and if the child is looking at learning to walk, sometimes you handhold that child, and the baby then tends to kind of leapfrog and takes support and then tries to walk. At a certain stage, once that particular initiation has been done, you will see that the child actually stands up, takes the support of the furniture in that room, or maybe the articles or objects in that room, to try and understand how his legs can support him, or how the process can happen in terms of him standing and then at least using some of these objects to travel across to different places in the room. So this is nothing but a process of self-initiation. And sometimes individually in your mind, what you do is you do clear goal setting, which is to look at, why am I doing this? How am I going to do this? And what are the things required for me to be able to achieve this? And that also is a process wherein you look at kind of, doing a bit of, let's put it this way, doing a bit of dilly dialing to understand, is this something which is going to work? Is this something which is not going to work? And that all kind of comes into the process of, something called, the clear goal setting. You will also see that a lot of people do a bit of personal orientation to try and achieve the goals. So imagine an athlete, which is looking at running, or, maybe looking at achieving something in terms of, say, 100-meter sprint in a particular amount of time under a certain time frame. Then what they look at is they look at a bit of personal orientation in terms of, is this something that I can achieve without professional help? Is this something that I can achieve without, any external intervention? Or does it require, just training, or does it require some additional bits of, efforts along with training to be able to achieve that? So clear goal setting, and also a bit of personal, orientation, which is related to motivation, and also looking at incremental steps in terms of goal setting to be able to achieve the overall goal, has to be looked at. And then you put some sort of a date or a timeline in mind to try and see whether this is going to go in that direction. So if I am trying to learn a new language, French, I give myself 6 to 8 months to be able to start speaking at a basic level. And if I don't find that I've picked up the language and I'm not being able to do, then at some stage what you will decide is that, okay, I think I've tried enough myself for about 5 to 6 months and it's not working. I think I need to go and attend some classes. So a realistic timeline has to be set so that you can try and measure your achievement and see if this is something that you've been able to achieve or not. And the process of self-reflection is nothing but looking backwards to see if what you undertook, as we say, a bit of hindsight, in terms of the steps that you undertook or the planning that you did or the basics that you put in place, did they work or not? Did they help you achieve that goal or not? So self-reflection is nothing but a way wherein it could look, when you look at it from this aspect, that did it help you learn maybe a new skill? You were trying to learn a language, but did it help you learn that particular language? Were you able to pick up a few skills? If you're not able to speak that well, but did you increase your vocabulary? So those are the things that you have to look at when you do a bit of reflection. And reflection is nothing but from a point of view of when the goals have been set, and what you do is you link it up saying, if I had taken a bit of help professionally, or if I had attended, maybe certain sessions, would that have changed my approach in terms of me picking up the language and me picking up faster, or achieving that goal maybe at a little better pace, is something that you look at with the process of something called self-reflection. So in this particular process of self-managed learning, or as we will call it SML, what we will look at is some of the clear stages that we need to cover to try and understand whether learning happens on an individual basis, or it happens on a team basis, or it happens when it is initiated through the professional development route, is what we will look at studying. Now, in terms of learning styles, very basic that we look at, in terms of learning styles is things like when people want to pick up or want to learn something. Sometimes when you go to a course, sometimes when you go to a class, what we do is we typically send across something called a learning style questionnaire. And these learning style questionnaires that we send is primarily looking at understanding of how the individual will basically be able to learn. So would there is something called the WARC as a terminology that we use, and this terminology that we use has been developed over the years by looking at people and their understanding in terms of how they learn or pick up things. Are you going to be looking at things from a visual perspective, and will that help you to learn in an effective manner? A stands for auditory. That means a lot of people who are able to listen and see, they are then classified under that particular style, wherein they're able to pick up skills, wherein sometimes you have to listen to it and you can then start doing it yourself. Reading, R stands for reading, and in the other bit which we look at is sometimes we see that the learners are able to learn things both on an auditory as well as a visual mode. So what we do get to see is that sometimes you use body language, which is kinesthetic. That means if at some point in time we see learners who are able to pick up things or learn things quite quickly, but they also make use of body gestures or hand gestures to be able to understand these things well, and that is what we call kinesthetic. So learning styles and preferences have to be understood. As a teacher, I need to understand that of what are the best ways to make you learn, or what are the best ways through which I can deliver this program or I can deliver this teaching, is something which is related to something called personal preferences. And if I go down in a bit more detail, would be related to things like how these personal preferences are captured is by looking at sending users across or asking the users to undertake something called the Work Questionnaire, which basically looks at picking up. It's a series of questions which are designed, and once you go through this particular questionnaire, what it does is it predicts and it comes out with some sort of a result to say that the person is going to be learning through a visual and auditory mode, or visual and kinesthetic mode, or through a visual and a reading mode. So that sometimes when I say I learn best when I'm on my own. I can do learning on my own. Sometimes you see and hear people say that, I think what I do is I tend to observe a lot of people, but at some point in time, if I can get something to read, maybe a manual and something like that, I then tend to pick up things myself because I will experiment. So those are the learning styles that we have to look at from a perspective of how individuals learn. And these are things which are picked up from an HR perspective within the organization. And sometimes the HR, colleagues or the managers basically send out this questionnaire, which is the Work Questionnaire, to try and see what is the best possible, circumstances or the best possible ways through which we can make this individual learn. And we need to pick up their personal preferences and the learning styles to adapt to be able to deliver that program, which makes it, the delivery of that program becomes much more effective if I adapt to the personal preferences of an individual of how they are going to learn, and that will hopefully, speed up the learning process from an individual's perspective. Now, interestingly, just to show and obviously note that this as a particular concept actually came across, through a study which was done by Professor Ian Cunningham in the 1970s. And what he did was he observed students in his class that he used to teach. And he then at some stage, what he did was he basically drew on his experiences and created and did an independent study to understand what are the various learning styles, which the students use to be able to learn within a classroom. Okay. And, this was then later underpinned or, further research and other things was done by another, fellow of his, which is Gregory Bateson. And he came up with, the theories of learning, which basically look at the behavioral aspect and also look at the various theories of learning which were put into place, of how individuals learn. And at the later stage, what he did was he basically focused on creating, and this is what we basically look at now, which is called the process of self-managed learning, wherein it became an approach. And in this approach, what tends to happen is that there are various elements of the learning process which gets added up, and that makes it conducive for the individual to be able to learn on its own. So the process of self-development, the process of self-learning, and a process of, the action-based learning, that means sometimes activities help individuals to learn better because they're able to correlate that in a much better aspect to what is being looked at from a prospect of, picking up in terms of skill. And these approaches then became, summarized under the approaches of something called the self-managed learning process. And this is defined as, an individual's. So if I look at, let's put it this way, if I look at it in an aspect wherein I say, okay, what is SML or what is self-managed learning as a process? Now, this is nothing but a process through which an individual learns, on its own. That means you initiate learning as a process on your own. And this process, because it is a process which you initiate yourself, there are, you use a combination of ways to be able to make sure that the learning at your end happens. An example, again, that I will give here is examples of things like, swimming and cycling. So when you look at cycling, you get a few lessons when you're learning to, pedal or learning to ride a bicycle. But what tends to happen is, even after maybe a few attempts, you are not able to ride the bicycle. What you do is you basically go at it, but you keep changing and adapting your, style in terms of riding the cycle so that it doesn't lead to, you falling and getting hurt. But at some stage, because of the continuous adaptation and the continuous changes that you're doing in your calculations of how to ride the bike, and you're determined to ride it, you at some stage, maybe in a day, half a day, 2 days, 4 days, 5 days, whatever it is, you learn to use the, you learn the concept of bicycling without using the stabilizers or the balancers. So this particular approach that we look at, in the concept of learning is basically self-initiated, and there are lots of things that come into it from an aspect of making sure that your determination, your traditional methods of looking at understanding experiences from others, how they understood, or what are the key steps to take when you're trying to learn to bicycle, the use of the user experiences that you put into place, which is from your previous say friends, or your parents and things like that. But all of that culminates into you actually at some stage learning to bicycle on your own, and that is nothing but the process of something called self-managed learning. Is that clear enough?
Yeah.
Okay. Now going back to these slides, in terms of, just let's briefly understand the various learning styles. Now there are 4 different types of learning styles that we come across, which are clearly defined. And the first one that we look at is something called activist. Now activist is, what do you see? There are different meanings of the word activist. So if I have to say activist as a learning style, what does the definition of activist mean?
Is it more like hands-on kind of?
Yeah, something like that. I would say yes. We are going. Say, if I just ask you to look at the definition of activist. Now, what is an activist? I think from a current context of general elections happening, it's a very, very pertinent word from a point of view of the definition. So when you look at an activist is a person who looks at bringing across a change. He or she actually campaigns to bring across change, and that is why we call that person, maybe some sort of a, he or she is something of a campaigner. They are looking at bringing across some sort of a change. And this term we normally come across, when we basically see that people, they continuously look at, going after something, or, in the sense they campaign against something because they are looking at bringing across some sort of a change. So similarly, when I define an activist from a point of view of, a learning style, what they basically do is, these people are in the world of their own, if I have to put it this way. And the activist learning style basically talks about, something to do with, they want to do it here and now. That means they want to do it now. They are open to ideas. They are quite enthusiastic in terms of, looking at trying new things. They're flexible in terms of, incorporating things into their approaches if they feel that you can convince them that that approach is better. And in some cases, what they look at is, one of the key aspects that we look at for activists is that they are people who act first. They are people who consider consequences later. They are believers of that, let's do it, and let's see what happens. So they believe in the main aspect of doing it first and then looking at the consequences. And these people normally seek to be in the center of the activity. That means whenever something is happening, they want to be seen as somebody wherein they are the center of that particular activity, or they are the center of that particular piece, or in terms of the work happening. And that is what we classify something as people being on the activist side. Now these styles that we are studying, they were basically created, or they were researched and studied by 2 different scientists, which we need to know. And one of them was Honey. It's basically called the Honey-Mumford learning styles. And at some stage, what had happened after their study, they created these styles, and they understood what is the various styles through which people do things, or in a way do things. They created these 4 different styles, which were called as activist, reflectivist, pragmatist, and theorist. And at some stage, this study which they created, and they came out with these 4 different types of learning styles, were then developed into another a theory which was done by another scientist called Klob, K-L-O-B. And we'll come to that in the subsequent slide. So a lot of study by them particularly was done to basically understand how people look at, picking up things from a point of view of, when it comes to learning, whether it's lifelong learning or whether it's self-managed learning. They basically looked at the aspect of, what are the different styles or preferences which people look at when they look at learning, anything, be it language, be it, an organ that you want to play, or, any activity that you pick up in personal or professional life. So the activist, from a contextual point of view, what we need to understand are people who look at acting first and look at considering consequences later. They are open-minded, enthusiastic, and flexible. These are the attributes which kind of define the type of people who fall in this category, which are activists. And they kind of immerse themselves into the experience. That means for them, the present is the most important. They don't look at the past that much, they don't look at the future that much, but for them, they immerse themselves in the present in terms of what is currently happening. Now, the other bit of style that we look at is pragmatists. Now, pragmatists basically plan. They have a plan for everything. They have a rationale for doing things. They basically think first and act later. So they are keen to look at new ideas, new theories, and they're keen on understanding how these ideas and theories or techniques can actually be put into practice. Now, they are always looking for new ideas, and they are always willing, forthcoming to experiment. They act quickly, they act confidently on ideas, but they also get straight to the point. So these are people who will be characterized by, having these particular traits, and they will be called pragmatists. In some cases, we also find that the pragmatists show a tendency of being a bit of impatient when it comes to endless discussions. So you will find that people, when they are not learning something, they tend to walk away from that situation because that debate or that discussion is not leading to a meaningful conclusion. And you will find this as a trait which is defined when we term people as that they have a learning style, or they are people who are pragmatists. The third type that we look at is people who are defined as theorists. That means they are keen to conclude. They are always keen to look at coming to conclusions. They think through the problems in a logical manner, apply a bit of rationale, but at some stage, what they do is they're keen on making or bringing things to a conclusion. So if you are looking at people who are termed as theorists, they basically look at, a very disciplined approach, wherein they follow a sequence of steps or a rational decision-making process, and then try and bring things to conclusion. Now, these people are also very, very good at assimilating, facts. That means they're good at, let's use the term from a point, they're very good in terms of learning things quite quickly. They are like a sponge. So if they find good practices or best practices or, things which are practices happening in general, they are able to basically pick up those things and, bring them into their own practice on a day-to-day or a routine basis. And these people, they follow a very rational process or a path, and that is why they are also sometimes called as, they are these are people who follow systems, and they are basically thinkers. So theorist is the third style, in which sometimes you get to see people will ask a lot of questions. They will basically, before even they are asked to do something, they will, want to confirm a couple of facts. And then once they know what is the eventual outcome going to be, then they decide to basically, kind of jump onto that bandwagon or jump onto that course or, that kind of, activity which they've been asked to do. And the last type of people that we look at is primarily people who are called reflectors. Now, reflectors basically, are people who basically learn by observing, others. That means they are the ones, if you see, we sometimes would say they have a very good photographic memory. That means if they observe people quite carefully, they are able to generally pick up things quite well. They are also, kind of people who kind of tend to avoid, jumping to conclusions. So they will normally take a back seat. They will let others do their bit first and observe what are the end results or, what is the outcome of that activity. And then what they do is they collect and analyze the data from what they have observed, and then try and slowly come to some sort of a conclusion. Okay, if I have to do this, I think what I need to do is take this approach because the other approaches that I've observed have not worked, and this is the approach which I need to take to be able to, do this particular activity or exercise. They are very good in terms of analyzing and searching for information which is available in the past, if such an event has happened, or if such an activity has happened, and they try and understand always the bigger picture before they get into it. So these are some of the key characteristics of how we basically define different types of personality, and they to a certain extent also extend to what is called the learning styles, or the preferences through which people actually learn. And at some stage what we do is we classify them, or we classify individuals from these definitions, and what we do is we group them into these 4 different types, which are activists, pragmatists, theorists, and reflectors. And once we know that this is the best learning style which is going to work for an individual because they fall into this particular classification, then what we can do is we can create activities around them, keeping in mind those basics through which we have understood their learning styles, and which will help them eventually learn better. Is this clear enough?
Yeah.
There's lots of information available on Honey and Mumford's learning styles on the web, and I'm going to send you a bit of a handout which basically will summarize their definitions and why do we look at these 4 different types to understand the process of self-managed learning. Now, what has happened over the years is that when Honey and Mumford actually carried out this particular study, which is in the 1980s, there's a lot of work which has been done on this further, and what we have looked at is we've looked at creating certain styles or methods through which learning happens when it comes to learning. So one side of things that we look at is basically the preferred learning styles, and that is coming across from Honey and Mumford study. The other thing that we look at is David Klobb, which basically is one of the other renowned scientists, or let's say the authors who basically looked at creating and studying this particular field further, created something called experiential learning style model. And this particular model, he defined, what he said is that, okay, these learning styles are fine, but within these learning styles, there are certain stages in which the individual actually learn. And these stages, he came up with a 4-stage cycle in which he actually summarized that the whole cycle of learning actually happens. And this, learning cycle which he created, is defined and is very well known as the Klobb's Experiential Learning Theory, or ELT. And that is what I mentioned here on the slide. Now, this ELT basically looks at bringing together a lot of work which has been done by previous, philosophers and scientists. And what he did was he summarized this, into this ELT theory. And there is a lot of work which has been done by other, psychologists and authors in terms of creating this particular framework. And what he did was he beautifully kind of, brought this across into the 4 stages of learning styles, which basically is concretized as this particular experiential learning theory, or Klobb's ELT theory. Now, just to look at pointing into these 4 stages, and I'll give you an example to understand all these. At some stage, the combination of 2 actually led to the creation of something called the learning style theories, which were based on Klobb's model and also on the the Work model, which I mentioned earlier, which is visual, auditory, and kinesthetic in particular. And these 2 models basically are broadly the material which are used by HR managers in particular, because of the context of personal and professional development, they are used by HR managers as material, as a part of their tools and techniques to understand the basic concepts of something called personality, self-awareness, self-development, and how the process of training and development is actually put into practice within the organization. So if I just repeat this, last bit to understand, these two models are used as kind of, groundwork or, framework by HR managers within the organization, which is the club's, learning style and the WARC model, to be able to understand how the overall, the concept of personality, self-awareness, development works from an individual perspective. And these things are used quite effectively by all the within all the organizations all over the world, to try and create programs wherein these programs then help develop the individuals within the organization and help them achieve certain skills, or help them achieve a skill set which is required for them to be able to do their jobs quite effectively. Now, in terms of understanding, these learning styles from Klopp's perspective, he defined something called the four-stage cycle. And this four-stage cycle, talks about concrete experiences, reflective observation, abstract conceptualization, and active experimentation. And these four stages is what we will go through, in these subsequent slides to understand. And I'll try and give you example to try and relate this in a much simpler fashion, and how do we relate this on a day-to-day basis from our perspective, is I'll summarize this. Now, the four types of different learning styles, they all represent, something which is, kind of depicted on this quadrant or matrix. Now, what he did was he basically plotted, four different aspects of learning which can happen onto a axis, X and Y axis. And when we look at, something, and the four styles that he basically talked about was, when we say we have concrete experiences, he basically said these experiences are experiences because you have kind of seen and experienced them in the past, and they are basically, factors which you have kind of developed because you have felt or watched something in the past which helps you develop this as a concrete experience. Now, an example of concrete experience would be if you try and put your hand over fire. If your hand gets burned once, you know clearly that this is fire and I don't need to do this. Correct?
Yeah.
Because you've had the concrete experience, or the practical experience of undergoing that particular exercise, that every time I put my hand over the flame, it burns my hand. You are not going to be doing that knowingly yourself because you've had the experience of your hand being burnt. Correct?
Yeah.
And that is classified as something called active concrete experience. Now, on the other side, if we look at reflective observation, this is a place wherein what we do is we basically try and watch and see how things are happening. And here, this side of learning happens. If I give you an example of, sometimes what you try and do is you look at the process of, you bought a piece of furniture from IKEA, say, for example, and what you try and do is you look at the manual, the manual of the, say, for example, a dining table or a chair which is you bought, and you try and look at the manual and try and assemble it by looking at the manual and trying to do this at your end. Now, this is nothing but wherein you're looking at the ability of basically, thinking, watching something maybe on a YouTube video or maybe on a manual and things like that. And what you're trying to do is trying to learn that particular, thing to be able to create or, assemble that furniture. And that bit is basically nothing but what he classified as something called reflective observation. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Now, the other bit that he looked at was there is a bit of learning which happens when you look at conceptualization, or when you look at the process of basically learning, right? Now here, what he basically thought of was that sometimes you imagine, a lot of things, and because you're imagining things, what you try and do is you try and visualize things in things and experiences that you've had in the past, and then you try and relate those experiences to what it can help you accomplish, or what it can help you, complete or maybe achieve. And that bit is basically nothing but the concept of abstract conceptualization. Now, to give you an example here would be that, assuming you have done, you know how to swim, right? And in the past, you have done, say, 20 lengths of the swimming pool. So you've said that you have the stamina. You basically thought of it that you have the stamina. And if I've been asked to do, say, 50 lengths, I think I should be able to do it without a particular break, or without needing external supervision. So an example here is that because you've visualized some of these things, and you've done it in the past because of some experience, what you think is that this is achievable. So if I have to go from 10 to 20, or from 20 to 50, this is achievable. So what you do is you conceptualize, and you kind of think it through in your mind. And because you're thinking it through in your mind, you are going through the individual steps and details of how this was just achieved the last time, and you try and put it into practice to try and achieve the goal of 50 lengths that you want to do in terms of swimming. And that process is nothing but the process of something called abstract conceptualization. Is that okay?
Yeah.
The last bit that we look at is basically called active experimentation. Now, what is active experimentation? Now, active experimentation is nothing but the process when we look at, something called, you're trying it, but you're not succeeding. You're trying it again, and you're not succeeding. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to actively experiment to try and see if I can achieve this again without external supervision in this case. So what you do is you process a lot of things, and then you try and do the task on your own. You again try, if it doesn't help you reach the goal, what you do again is you try and again process certain, reorient certain things in that particular process, and try and again have a go at it. Now, the process of active experimentation, in terms of an example, if I have to give you, would be the fact that if you're helmet and quite determined to be able to achieve those things, or maybe a goal and objective that you've set on your own, what you keep doing is you keep doing that process of something called, improving yourself, revising, improving, and then again going at it, revising, improving, and again going at it. And that process would basically constitute something called, I would say, active experimentation. So an example here would be that, a practical example that I would give you is, let's put it this way. A good one that I can think of is, you're giving a theory test or a driving test, right? Now, at some stage, what you've done is you've done a lot of reading about your, the driving test, and you've reversed a lot of questions, and you've gone out and you've passed the theory. Now, what you want to be able to do is now you want to do the practical test. Now, the practical test that you're looking at doing is, you can't visualize it, you can't think about it, you can't watch and learn, from it. There is at some stage you have to go out and do it yourself. Correct? Now, in order for you to pass, you have to get into the thick of, thick of things, and you have to go and take an exam, and you have to prove to the person who's taking the practical test that yes, you can drive the vehicle safely. Now, if you do not end up passing, you're handed over a sheet, and it gives you a number of points where you have not been able to meet the criteria. And what you do is, on your own, you will go in, you'll sit in the car, you'll probably put somebody, request somebody to sit across with you, and you will go and achieve those. You will do the actual, physical thing of driving the car to try and achieve those things before you go again and take a test. Correct?
Yeah.
And that is the process of nothing but something called active experimentation, because you can drive the car, but you're not meeting the criteria of actually doing the test or passing the test. What you do is you practice again and again, and you experiment in a way, okay, I should have done this, or I could have done that. And that is where you get into the process of something called active experimentation. Now, within this particular quadrant, if you see, there are different types, personality types, which have been, kind of fitted in. So if you're leaning towards, something that you like to do yourself, and you also think and visualize things before you do it, you're basically a pragmatist. Can you see that?
Yeah.
Now, if I believe in doing things on my own, if I like to experiment, but I also like at the end of it, once I've done the experimentation, to perfect what I've done, then you will fall into something called experimentation. Because activists, if you recall, do not worry about the outcome. What they do is they want to go and do it. So what they will do is they lean towards being activists because they believe in experimentation, but they also believe in that if I do the things myself, then I will be able to learn and pick up the practical experience or practical side of things. People who are called reflectors, what they look at is they look at their own concrete experiences, but they also believe that if I can watch and understand where others are failing and look at the drawbacks, or look at the stages in places wherein they could not complete or they failed, is something that I can learn from, and then they look at doing, are people who basically fall into that category of being reflectors. And simulators, or people who are theorists, fall into the category wherein what they look at is they believe in letting others do things first. They'll believe in watching, and once they have observed, significantly or observed enough, what they then look at doing is they put their own brain or their own rational thinking into it, and then they look at doing things. And that is why these people are basically system oriented. They are people who basically follow, the rule book, and they are termed as something called theorists. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Now there are various examples, and I think this is an exercise or something, as an activity, because using this particular model, a lot of tests, personality tests, have been developed, which are used by professional organizations, HR departments. And one such test that I will send you a link of, that you can do just to look at which style your personality is, or what kind of learning style do you have. I would send you a link of tests which are developed by Myers and Briggs, and these are things which you can, I'll send you a website link wherein you can take this test, just to understand yourself, your learning style, and your personality. And it will be something which you can, maybe do it at a leisure time, or as a time wherein it'll help you understand your personality a bit better. Where we get to see the implementation of this happening within the real world context is that when there are people being recruited in organizations at senior positions or in positions which are of strategic nature, then the HR has to do a lot of analysis to try and see whether the personality, whether the learning style, and what kind of an individual they will want to put into that particular position or that role. And they use this particular framework and these particular learning styles and these frameworks and models from CLOB, and then they put it into some sort of tests which are called personality tests. And there are lots of them. And one of the very popular ones, which even I've done at some stage, are the Myers and Briggs tests, which most organizations end up employing when they are looking at hiring individuals into teams. Specifically, when you look at the sectors like call centers, for example, where people have to work within teams, programmers or coders which work within teams, and they want to be able to bring the right set of individuals who have the right approach and a balance between what is required to be done, how it is required to be done, and whether they can comply with the law and the legislation or the rules and regulations within an organization. And that is where, in the context of this particular thing, is why we study this concept of something called self-managed learning and lifelong learning. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Now, so Explained, in the next few slides are basically these two learning styles which were developed by Honey and Mumford, and obviously later, David Klobb actually looked at putting, putting these studies into, much more detailed practice to try and create something called the ELT, cycle, or the learning model theory, which then is utilized, by at various stages within the HR and, within the leadership and management sector, in order for us to create teams, put people within teams, and also to look at, understanding how people in general learn when they are put into different contexts. For example, within, from a point of view of, say, learning within an organization, within, say, academic, when you look at programs and various stages. So this particular model has a far-reaching, implication, and it can be put across to some sort of a test or working, in various sectors. And I think in the field of teaching, we study this as, one of the key frameworks, which helps us understand how teaching is regulated, how teaching is delivered, and also to a certain extent understand the learner's point of view in terms of how teaching can be enabled so that the teaching is enjoyable, teaching is, for example, fun, and to a certain extent, it leads to development of learning, the concept of development of learning with learners itself within the academic field. Is that okay?
Yeah.
There's a bit of a monologue, but I think that's how theoretical concepts are. Now, some of the basic things which I'm just going to touch on right now, rather than go in a bit more detail, would be that when we look at the concept of self-managed learning, there are lots of approaches through which people learn. And some of these approaches, what I've done is I've just highlighted them as bullet points. So learning happens through research. That means, you're looking at maybe an area of interest, and that is something that you're reading, researching on your own. Learning from others is also one of the approach, wherein sometimes if I'm not able to do a task like the Rubik's Cube, I remember when I was a child, I couldn't do the Rubik's Cube quite well. And then at some point in time, I needed to go across to my friends and, understand what's the logic of how to solve this. And that constituted something called learning from others. You sometimes are not able to solve certain problems. So what you do is you take professional help. You go to your friends, family, peers, colleagues, and also learn from that aspect. Mentoring and coaching is also a form of self-managed learning, wherein you want to learn because you're influenced by that person, and you kind of treat that person as your mentor or as a coach, and you learn from them. There is also self-managed learning which happens on a bigger scale, wherein you learn externally by attending seminars, conferences. You're given the opportunities to look at secondments. That means, if your manager is away and you've been given the responsibility of taking over that particular role for a certain point in time, it's a secondment, and you also learn from experience there because you're doing things on that aspect. You learn from interviews. This is a very kind of a very pertinent route nowadays, that a lot of people learn from interviews because they come across a lot of candidates, a lot of interview questions, a lot of new techniques, and sometimes you get to learn a lot of things because companies conduct a lot of interviews, and through which they get to know various viewpoints from various candidates that they're meeting. The use of internet, it wasn't something which was prevalent when this study was done, the concept of self-managed learning, and that's why it originated in the classroom, wherein Professor Ian Cunningham actually looked at the concept of how people learn within a class, and that was then extrapolated to looking at the concepts of learning. The internet allows you to do a lot of research. You can do pretty much, at an instant, at a click of a button, you can pick up a few things, or you want to find something, you can use the internet. My kids at the home, use Alexa, the Amazon, Echo Dot, and they say, okay, if they have to find an answer to a question, they will ask Alexa, can you tell me about this? And that uses the use of internet to gain information, or to look at, say, solving a problem. My 5-year-old would basically say, Alexa, can you tell me what is 4 times 4? And she would answer 16. So internet is also a way wherein you can look at self-managed learning. Social networks, again, an extrapolation of, usage of internet. Sometimes, when your network is down or you're not getting a particular service, you go onto Twitter rather than call up the company, because most of the companies would post an update on the social network. So again, a process through which you are able to get information and could kind of enhance learning. And the use of bulletin boards and news groups, when you follow or you become a part of groups, to try and gain information through discussions and, brainstorming sessions and things like that, would also be looking at the process of, something called self-managed learning. Is that okay? Clear enough today, Phil?
Yeah.
Right. Now, what I'm going to do is obviously stop at this, because the second bit, which is looking at lifelong learning, is something which is the other side of learning which happens. So you look at SML and you look at the other approach, which is lifelong learning, and this is what we will do, in the next session.
Okay.
Is that okay? Now, before I end this session, what I would again kind of ask you to focus on is that if you try and complete your PPD, in particular, and try and complete your SWOT analysis, then what we want to do is giving you a broader understanding in terms of the learning styles, the learning approaches, and the models. What we want to be able to look at is try and develop and understand what is the approach that you're going to look at when you look at your self-evaluation.
Okay.
And the other bit, what I would do is basically send you a link today of the Myers and Briggs pre-personality test. And this is something which is a good thing you can take, and it gives you a bit of an example in terms of how and what type of personality you are. And what we are going to do is certain things which are flagged up in terms of, in your SWOT analysis, and certain things which come out from this particular thing, we will then look at putting it into your PDP as an area of improvement or as an area of review that you want to look at on your personal development plan.
Okay.
Okay, I'll send you a link of this, but there are various personality tests that you can do. Try and take the Myers and Briggs test, which is quite a detailed one. It requires about 15 minutes to about half an hour to be able to concentratedly do this particular test, and then it gives you a lot of different styles of understanding your personality. But the basic essence of all these tests is that they have come out of these two frameworks of the Myers and Briggs, the framework of Klopp's learning cycle, and the other one which is to do with the aspect of the Honey and Mumbles learning styles. So they help you understand a bit of your personality, how you learn, and these will be things which will be interesting and also important for you to be able to kind of do your skills audit and to help you develop your personal development plan. Is that okay?
Okay. Yes, fine.
An handout that I'm going to send to you is this, which basically summarizes what we have covered today in a neat 4 or 5 page document, which will help you understand the various concepts of managed learning, the lifelong learning, and how it will help you in developing your PDP. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Good stuff. Thanks for joining in today. I think some of the invites which I've noticed obviously have the old dates appearing in, and I've not bothered basically changing them. But at some